So we'd like to welcome and thank Rabbanit Chana Henkin for joining us for this very, very important discussion to discuss the philosophy of psak of her late husband, Rabbi Yehuda Henkin, Zichrono Livracha. And we're looking forward to a very interesting and insightful discussion. Everyone who's watching this probably knows Rabbanit Henkin already, who is the founder and the dean of Nishmat, and as well as founder, along with Rabbi Henkin, Rabbi Rahaftig, and others, of the whole initiative of Yoatzot Halacha that has really transformed the observance of Tarat HaMishpacha and advanced education for women in Torah as well. So Rabbanit Henkin, thank you so much for accepting our invitation to speak about your husband and to share your insights with the members of the RCA and beyond.
Thank you for giving me this opportunity.
Okay, so why don't we get started? And if you could perhaps give us an insight as to what formed the worldview of Rabbi Henkin that made him into the psak and the rabbi and the teacher that he was.
He had a keen understanding of modernity. It came from the home he grew up in, the institutions, the schools that he attended, and his having studied with his grandfather for 5 years. His upbringing was unusual. He attended public school as a young child. His parents were not satisfied with any of the local options that were available to them. I believe there was one local option. So he attended public school. He spoke Hebrew already as a very young child. Hebrew was spoken freely in his home. He lived near Yale, and his parents had many visiting professors from Israel, including some who were ultimately recipients of the Israel Prize, as not just guests in their home, but some moved into their home for a period of time. So Hebrew was there. He studied at home. He was an autodidact, I would imagine, from young childhood onwards. He read everything. When it came time for high school, he had an aunt who was living in Brooklyn. So his parents sent him to the yeshiva of Flatbush, and he lived with his aunt. Thereafter, he spent a year at Kerem B'Yavneh. This is before American students came to Kerem B'Yavneh, or in numbers. And afterwards, he was a student at Columbia. When he would, during his time at Columbia, he sat and learned Torah a good number of hours a day, often by himself. He walked up to Yeshiva University on a regular basis to hear Rav Aaron Soloveitchik's shiur. Thereafter, when he was in the course of his MA, from one day to the next, he made a decision: my Zaidi is not going to live forever, and he dropped out of Columbia. And eventually he picked it up again, but he dropped out literally from one day to the next. And he went to learn with his grandfather. The family had an apartment adjacent to his grandfather's on the Lower East Side. And a member of the family was usually there in order to not be a caretaker, but in order to support, to be there, in order to provide whatever was needed. And so Rav Henkin moved into that apartment. He was then Yehuda Henkin, and he learned with his grandfather for many hours a day. Sometimes he slept in his grandfather's apartment. There were sweet anecdotes from that period, because he asked his grandfather once why he doesn't unplug his phone at night. My husband would be sleeping on the couch and the phone would ring very late, and his grandfather, who was around 90 then, said, Well, Rav Moshe is a very young man, Rabbi Feinstein, and I believe he was in his late 70s then. I would imagine there was a 15-year difference between the two of them. So Rav Moshe is a young man, and the women are probably uncomfortable phoning him, so they phone me. And so when you talk about formative experiences and the merging of worlds, he he lived in Dalet Amot Shel Halacha, but he knew what was happening in the 75% of the Orthodox world that went to secular universities, or that was not Orthodox. It's not a usual background, and I think it impacted him later on as a psak in the sense that he didn't have a sense of commitment to a particular ideology, to a particular yeshiva. He didn't feel he had to toe a particular party line. He was after the truth, and he was going to speak his mind, regardless of the implications of what he had to say.
He was a very independent thinker as well.
Yes. He had no patience with convention. He believed you had to tell the truth, and he was truthful. He was a person of integrity and truth. He was a Henkin. I was familiar with those qualities from a number of members of the Henkin family, and I saw it as well in my late son, and my husband had it. He was not. He was fearless. I think he feared God, but he did not fear people. I don't mean that he wasn't aware of criticism. He certainly was, and sometimes the criticism was painful, but that wasn't going to hold him back from saying what he believed needed to be said.
How did he deal with that criticism?
It's interesting. He lived in many times at the same time. Anyone who walked into our house would not merely see a good library, but they would see Sfarim open. And if you heard him read the Haftarah, and he did so frequently because when we had young children, I wouldn't go to shul, and so when he would come home, I would ask him to read the Haftarah to me, and he would do so. And as often as not, he would cry with emotion. He would try not to, but it just happened. The extent of identity with the past and with his grandfather, who was the prime religious influence in his life, was so great that I can't say the criticism sloughed off his shoulder. I can't say that. There were times that it was painful, but what was really painful was not criticism. What was painful that occurred more than once was a refusal to publish his writings. Sometimes they were so far from the party line, or they were considered to be so delicate that there were those who felt that this should not be spoken about. And his feeling was, no, lehefech. If these kinds of issues are not spoken about by an ish halacha, then whom are they going to be spoken about by?
Mhm. Yes. One of the things that he's known for, I imagine, in the larger world, is his openness towards creating opportunities for women in learning and in community roles. How did he come to that?
Here, let me get one of his first volumes. I don't really know the answer to that. Some people tend to think, oh, he was married to Chana and that's where it came from. I don't think so. I'm sure there was some impact, but as I said before, he lived at one and the same time in the modern world and in the latter generation of the Lithuanian great Torah scholars. I mean, that's where he was. That's what his life was. It was both, and I was looking after he passed away at his tshuvot, and I went back to a tshuva that he wrote very early on. We were then living in Beit Sha'an. We had made Aliyah as a young couple to Israel, and we traveled an unusual route. That was him. We went to live in a development town, which in some ways was an extension of the model of the American rabbinate. The fact of going out to someplace that needed you and being a rabbi there. So he was eventually chosen as regional rabbi for the Beit Shan Valley going up to the Golan. And there was a rabbi in another community in Israel at this time who exchanged writings together with him. I don't remember how it started. It must have started that they met each other at some point, and this other rabbi sent us a circular in which he told the women of his community that they were making a mistake by coming to shul on Shabbat with little children. That as a result of the mothers being in shul, the children came to shul and they disturbed the service. And this rabbi wrote that the women apparently don't understand fully that this is the reason that they're exempted from the responsibility of mitzvot aseish azman grama, and they should perform the responsibility that was given over to them. And he wrote, and I don't think I had any influence upon him. I think this was his attitude. He wrote back a short, marvelous, and scathing tshuva in which he wrote that when you say the women are mistaken, I'm not sure what you're thinking of. If you're thinking of the Rambam's view that women are obligated to pray, but they're not obligated to the language to pray, mida oraita. Well, the other Rishonim differ with the Rambam, and the women may be following the majority of Rishonim. And then he went on to say that, listen, today women go out, and halavai that they should go out to shul. And then he did what he always did in his tshuvot. He read very closely. He goes back to the Ramah, who permits on the basis of Trumat Hadeshen women women who have the custom in those communities not to attend shul when they're nida. And he the Rama says, but he quotes Truman Hadeshin, or cites Truman Hadeshin, that on the Yamim Noraim, when everybody is there in shul, the women have tremendous ogmat nefesh. They have itzavon gadol, and not being part of shul, and therefore, on those days they do go to shul, contrary to the prevailing minhag. So, looking at this, Rav Henkin says, Trumat Hadeshin doesn't say itzavon gadol. He just says itzavon. In other words, you just need pain. You don't need anguish in order that the community take your needs into consideration.
Mm-hmm.
Where this came from, I don't know, but his mother taught college. His grandmother was a remarkable, and his maternal grandmother, whom we had the privilege of knowing, she lived to 104 years old. She was a feisty lady. I can't say more than that, other than that he took people seriously. He took their suffering seriously, and he was not quick to dismiss suffering. In another tshuva about the presence of the husband in the delivery room, a certain rabbi said that if you tell women they shouldn't be afraid, they won't be afraid. He was speaking about Yishuv Hadat B'Yoledet. And he wrote back to that other rabbi, they won't say that they're afraid,
Mm-hmm.
but you haven't done anything. You haven't done anything to assuage their fears.
Wow. How did he go about paskening a shiloh? What was the process?
He writes about that. Let's see if I can find that quickly. He writes about that in one of the introductions. Here it is. He says, I'm going to say this in English because we're speaking in English, but he writes, of course, in Hebrew. He says, sometimes I know in advance the conclusion that I'm going to reach. And sometimes I don't know, but I think and I examine as I write. In other words, I've written something, sometimes I'll go back and erase it and start again. כשאני עסוק בתשובה, אני מהרהר בה בחלום ובהקיץ. This is something that I was familiar with for decades. בלכתי בדרך ובשוכבי ובקומי וכאן באמצע הסעודה. How many times did I remonstrate with him, and now thankfully I thank HaKadosh Baruch Hu that he didn't listen to me and stay seated at the table. He would get up in the middle of the meal. We have a very good library of Rishonim, and some of it was Rav Henkin's Atzal, the great Rav Henkin's, and some he accumulated during the years, and you could find him in the middle of the night having thought of something. So he's back at the dining room table and it's covered with svarim, and he'll get up, la'ayin shuf b'sfarim, or lirshom ezer ra'ayon, ki ke'esh atzur li ba'atzmotai. And something that he was quick to say to others was, have you looked it up? It's like the illustration I gave of the Ramah quoting the Trumat Hadeshin, and he goes back to the Trumat Hadeshin, and Trumat Hadeshin says Itzavon, not Itzavon Gadol. And he always looked up when there was a reference to something earlier. He would go back to the Sfarim. He used the Bar Ilan Responsive Project in the course of all 4 books, probably about 2 or 3 times. I know this because it was on my computer and I use it daily. It wasn't on his computer. So I don't think he ever sat down at my computer to try to use it. In the early version, I do remember his looking next to me with a sense of amazement when the initial Bar Ilan project had this bar at the bottom, and you could see the scanning of the literature, the totality of the literature in seconds. So he was intrigued by that, but it was on my computer. The Sfarim were open, and it sometimes took him time. He would sometimes plan to arrive at a certain conclusion, and then he would change his mind midstream and go back and look and look and look and look. But as I say to my students, not all of us are capable of looking and seeing what he saw. He would, he had the ability to do two things. He described our son, Rabbi Tam, this way, and this was certainly true of our son, but I think it was true of our son's father as well. He said that he had the ability to both see details with precision and also see the large picture. So you asked about women. I strayed from the subject of women, but there's no question that his answers were also fertilized by questions that reached him. If you look at his tshuvot, you see he writes, going back to the first volume, the tshuvot will usually say at the beginning, L'sho'el echad, l'rav echad. This is 1 second. Here. L'rav shel yishuv echad, l'rav shel yishuv echad, ללומדי ישיבת ערב בבית שאן, לחבר כולל במושב אחד, לרב של יישוב אחד, לרב של יישוב אחד, again לרב של יישוב אחד, לרב אחד, לגדול אחד, לאישה אחת, למוהל אחד, לרב אחד. The questions vary, the questions vary with the years, but the address of his questions is very interesting. If you look at Rabbi Feinstein's tshuvot, they always tell you who's being addressed, or almost always tell you who's being addressed by the name of the person who asks the questions. If you look at Rabbi Ovadia Yosef's questions, he'll often say v'nishalti. That's the classic style. The Rashba writes that way, v'nishalti. My husband specified the position, le'tamida shel midrasha achat, and that's obviously to an Ishmat student. He did that while he didn't specify the name because he felt that it was it was critical to understand whom he was writing to. When he was asked why he didn't write the questioner's name, so he basically gave 3 answers. He said, first of all, I wouldn't know by what title to address him. He had no patience with titles. So I wouldn't know whom to call, with this superlative or that superlative. Secondly, he said, not all of the questions that I would ask would the questioner wish his name to be associated with. He was asked very, over the years, very delicate questions, and he addressed those questions, and you see a lot of those in the fourth volume of his Tshuvot, but also in others. And he also, I think, wished to reserve for himself the possibility of, or the option of responding critically to the question. And he wasn't going to, of course, shame the questioner. So we get to know that this was written to a woman. I don't think there are that many Tshuvot written to a woman. And he that, that women asked him questions, and women, once he answered one question, I think now I'm finally answering what motivated him. Of course, there was a combination of the background, his training, the larger world that he lived in, and he read everything, including the cornflakes box at the table. He was reading all of the time. His mind was encyclopedic. He remembered things, although he complained about his memory. But to a lesser mortal like me, the retention was astounding. When he was asked a question by a woman, I discovered years afterwards that there was a particular group of women who were consulting him, and he was telling them what the halacha was, without necessarily agreeing with fully with their views and their ideology, but he was there to answer them. So I think a lot of the occupation with women's questions was just generated by the community. These were people who were asking him questions, and he was going to answer, because halacha applies to every area of our life, and that's what you do. You ask the question, you answer it.
Very interesting. My late wife, Sarah, Alaa Shalom, has a cousin who lives in Israel, who actually one of the Tshuvot is written to her.
Oh,
Shelley Picard, and she was asking about music, and when music has its source in Christian music, how it is used. Very proud that he responded to her so sensitively with such depth, but also that was included in the Sfarim as well.
oh, now I know who that Tshuvah was written to.
There we go. There we go. What was his view of the state of the Orthodox world? And you don't have to answer my questions.
Yeah, I'm not sure how I would answer that. I'm not sure how he would answer the state of the Orthodox world. I know that when we moved to Israel, you could probably count on two hands the number of rabbis in Israel who had a college degree. Possibly considerably fewer than that. Maybe even on one hand. So he came, this goes back almost 50 years. He came to Israel with an unusual background. He remained in his mind very much connected to American Orthodoxy. He continued to read and continued to appreciate, and to be up to date with what was going on, what was occupying American Orthodoxy and American modern Orthodoxy. At the same time, he was a firm Zionist. He as a rabbi, he was exempt from army service, and he went and he volunteered. And I was like any other wife in Israel whose husband goes off for a month, and you hear from him. This is before cell phones. You hear from him occasionally. His identification with the state of Israel, his excitement about the state of Israel, was tremendous. On the other hand, I believe he was quite frustrated with the fact that we Orthodox Jews, especially in Israel, tend to wear uniforms. And if you're not wearing a particular uniform, it's you're not taken seriously enough by the people who wear those uniforms, and he refused to wear a uniform. Yes, he did for many, many years wear a frock coat, and that was because Reb Avrom, who was chief rabbi for a period of time, a tremendous Talmid Chacham, Reb Avram Shapira, every time that my husband would go to visit him, would say, Harav Henkin, eifo hafrok shelcha. So eventually he thought to himself, well, you know, Reb Shapiro wants him to be, this happened early on when we were in Israel, before Reb Shapiro became chief rabbi. That was at a time when the chief rabbis were of tremendous standing. Halachic standing. He identified with that group, but also as one who reads his Chuvot knows he was independent, so he respected thinkers, and Barosh and Barishona, his grandfather was before his eyes at all times. It's interesting, when he was 10 years old, a 10-year-old child growing up in New Haven, Connecticut, his ideal, his goal was to be like his grandfather. He said that when he was 20 years old, he despaired of that. When he was 30 years old, he found himself following in his grandfather's path.
You mentioned that he spent a number of years learning with his grandfather, Rav Henkin. What did he learn from him? What was that legacy?
That was that was for him formative. You couldn't be with either Rav Henkin, with Rav Henkin Zatzal, the Gaon, or as my husband would have rebuked me and said, you can't say our names in the same breath. But you couldn't be with either without having a sense not just of the erudition, the familiarity, the familiarity with the world, but also Seichel HaYashar, straightforward logic. You know, you see this also in my husband's Perush al HaTorah. We're so privileged. It's something that bubbled for many years. My late son had a role in editing, a very central role, and then I took over after we lost him. We were gifted to publish this half year before my husband passed away. And you really see there that he's walking beside the patriarchs, and he's looking at them, not by lowering them to our level, but by understanding them in terms of the way human beings behave, because they were human beings. They were great human beings, but they were human beings. The Seichel HaYashar, I don't have another way of expressing it, is something that I believe it came in the genes, but also when he sat and he learned with his grandfather, well, not just the Seichel HaYashar, also the humility, the fact that you don't go around with a pose. You don't look to see who's agreeing with you. You may be very interested in seeing who's agreeing with you, but you don't look to curry favor with others. You do what's right, you say what's right, you say what's true, and seichel hayashar.
Okay, so about his legacy, tell us about his legacy.
Well, there are his writings. There are 4 volumes of Chuvot that accrued over the course of almost 50 years. There are several books in English that he wrote. They're there, and what I'm seeing is that the public is catching up with him. Since he was niftar, there's been a run on his Sfarim, so that right now there's 1 copy left of his first volume, and the Sfarim need to be reprinted. Some of the English books are out of print, and they'll be reprinted again. So certainly a very significant portion of his legacy is thankfully there in writing. But on top of that, there are the thousands of people whom he helped in his lifetime. And I would say that he redrew the landscape for women within Orthodoxy. Totally. People often talk about what I've accomplished, but his were the broad rabbinic shoulders. I could never have, I could never accomplish what I did without it being the work of the 2 of us. There was a partnership over the course of decades, and I think of myself as the activist personality, but the courage, the readiness to do what needed to be done without looking at the consequences, that was him, and the broad rabbinic acceptability. So when we look today at over, I think the number is around 140 Yoatzot Halakha today in the world, all over the world, and active in Israel, active, they've gotten hundreds of thousands of questions. We have him to thank for this. We have, he was the one who put his head on the chopping block in order to make this happen. And he never looked back. He oversaw the process very carefully. For the first decade, the Tu'udah, which he was the one who authored, that is given to Yoatzot Halakha, said that it needed to be reviewed after 10 years because he wanted to see how it was, how this was going to develop, how it was going to play itself out. And after 10 years, we convened all of the Yoatzot who had received their diplomas during 10 years in order to be recertified. And at that time, he made the decision that it was not necessary to come back to the Rabbanim. 10 years later, he was pleased as could be with the way it had developed. He himself, initially, when his speech was still clear, he was a consultative address for all of the Yoatzot who could phone him and who did phone him with their questions before they answered. There were the kinds of questions that they could answer on their own, and then there were kinds of questions that needed to be discussed with a psak. And I enjoyed very much overhearing one side of those conversations because I could see that when some of the Yoatzot, the ones who were really the most gifted, argued with him, he was delighted. He was delighted, and he mentored. He mentored Yoatzot. It eventually moved over to the website, which corresponded with his physical state at that point, he was able to look over the questions and approve them or comment. And over the course of 2 decades, he mentored Yoatzot. So when I think of his legacy, um, the world has changed for Jewish women, and he had a pivotal role in that, to the extent that a month before he passed away, it was already becoming too difficult for him to sit in a chair and to have me read the questions to him and the answers and for him to approve it. So at that point, he turned the reins of the English website over to Rabbi Kenneth Alman. But um, the night before he passed away, the night before who alali ginzei meromim, we heard that Rabbi Alman had corona. Thankfully, he recovered, and at May of the Esrim, he will be well and gifted with fortitude. But we heard that he was ill and unable to take questions. We actually were making a mistake because Rabbi Evan was able to read the website, but he couldn't answer the phone. The corona was too strong. So I asked my husband if he would be willing to go over the questions, and he said yes. So I read him the questions, and as was his wont, he was all about precision in formulation. So he corrected a word here and there. He had an addition to make. He said what he said, and I typed his words. And then afterwards, when he finished reviewing the questions that had come in that day, this was what he had done for 20 years. It's from the time the website was established. He would read over what the Yoatzot drafted, and then he would make his comments, and sometimes he would send them back to rewrite, and sometimes he would approve, and sometimes he would add what he had to say. So that night, which turned out to be his last night at home, the following night we rushed to the emergency room, and what happened several hours later. But that very last night, I asked him after we finished, "Do you miss it?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "Would you wish to do this again?" And he said, "No."
Wow.
So
we are
there's a big legacy
community
there.
and a much better world, and many more opportunities for so many people in teaching and in leading and in observing halacha as a result of his activities.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.